Hong Kong is the most expensive property market in the world.
Transport systems, telecommunications are all in the hands of a wealthy elite who also dominate the property sector.
What you are looking at is not a prison cell, but somebody's home. In an area of just 2 square meters, about the same size as a phone booth, is one of Hong Kong's infamous coffin homes. With one shared bathroom between 20 people, these are not outliers. Across the small city, more than 200,000 people live in conditions like this. This is the harsh reality of a city that has simply run out of space, leaving thousands with no choice but to live in cages. In Hong Kong, the average home costs 18 times the average family income. This is the worst housing crisis in the world. But while all this has been happening, another story has also emerged. Last year, the wealthiest 10% of households in Hong Kong earned 82 times more than the poorest 10%. This figure has more than doubled in just 5 years. At the centre of this are 4 families who dominate Hong Kong's real estate through their Big 4 conglomerates. With a combined net worth exceeding $100 billion, they control over half of Hong Kong's private housing, vast land reserves, and assets larger than the city's annual GDP. While millions are crammed into tight conditions, the city's 6 richest property tycoons are manipulating land supply and driving prices even higher. But as we researched this topic more, we found that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Hong Kong appears to be a wealthy city, but behind the glittering skyrises is another story of a dystopian country, run by a few secretive individuals. This is the sad reality of Hong Kong. This is Kai, a 60-year-old cleaner in Hong Kong's Mong Kok district. For $300 a month, he gets to rent this bedbug-infected section, measuring just 20 square feet. For him, even this is preferable to eviction, with nowhere else to go, and no resettlement arrangements. For single applicants like him, the wait for public housing can stretch longer than 10 years. This situation didn't happen overnight. Hong Kong has a long history of poor living conditions. But to understand how one of Asia's richest cities forces so many to live in cages, we need to look back. Because decisions made decades ago have built this dystopian landscape. Modern-day Hong Kong was born out of war. Britain didn't inherit it, they took it. And with that seizure came a new rule. As the British were essentially starting from scratch with disregard to who had owned what before, all land would instead be owned by the government and then leased to individuals and businesses. A decision made in 1841, which still controls the price of rent in 2025. After World War II, Hong Kong's strategic location and business-friendly policies sparked a rapid transformation. China had just experienced a revolution, and Hong Kong became a popular destination for migrants fleeing political turmoil in the mainland, bringing in the entrepreneurial drive and cheap labour, something the locals were quick to take advantage of. By the 1950s and 60s, Hong Kong had become a manufacturing powerhouse, producing everything from textiles to electronics for exports. Hong Kong's economy exploded. Its GDP multiplied 20-fold in less than 2 decades, transforming a coastal outpost into a capitalist powerhouse. It became a global trade hub, joining Taiwan, South Korea and Singapore as one of Asia's 4 tigers, the fastest growing economies in the region. But the faster a city grows, the more fragile its foundations become. By the 1980s, manufacturing had begun its inevitable decline. Companies were starting to move operations to mainland China, where labour was cheap and costs were lower. If they wanted to stay one step ahead, Hong Kong had to chase something different. They pivoted to finance. Having already established themselves as an economic powerhouse, it wasn't too hard to persuade multinational corporations to set up headquarters on the island. And by the 1990s, more than 10,000 firms were moving into Hong Kong every single year. It became one of the world's leading financial centres. But as the clock ticked toward the end of the British rule, the future was starting to look uncertain. As the 1997 handover loomed, many feared what would happen once China took control. The communist regime was renowned for ruling with an iron fist, with media takeovers and asset seizures commonplace. Capital flight was inevitable. Investors and wealthy residents pulled hefty amounts of money out of the country, and within months, the Hang Seng Index plunged by over 20%. Then, just as the transition was underway, another disaster struck. Asia hit a debt crisis. But beneath the surface, a deeper problem was brewing. With just over 1,000 square kilometers of land, Hong Kong was struggling to keep up with a growing wave of people chasing opportunity. By 1999, population density in the city had soared past 6,000 people per square kilometer, 150 times the global average, surpassing even London and New York. Since its boom period, the population had nearly tripled, but the land had stayed the same. Housing had become scarce and increasingly unaffordable. This was the era that gave rise to Hong Kong's cage homes, tiny wire mesh compartments crammed into overcrowded flats. First seen as a temporary fix in the 1950s for the migrant boom, they became a lasting symbol of the city's housing crisis. As property values climbed to some of the highest in the world, the dream of home ownership drifted further out of reach for the average worker. But that was just the beginning of the real nightmare. What would happen next turned a system which was unequal into one which was completely rigged. When China took over Hong Kong, it inherited a city with potential, but also laden with imperfections. Many thought that Hong Kong, and especially its outdated housing policies, would soon be a thing of the past. But the system Britain built to enrich the empire wasn't torn down by China. Instead, it was adopted and perfected. As the city reeled from the financial crash, Hong Kong's newly appointed government needed solutions fast. They had an economy to stabilise, businesses to keep afloat, and a population to reassure. So instead of reforming the system, they doubled down, slashing the top rate of income tax from 25% to just 16%. The logic was simple. Lower taxes would encourage consumer spending, drive demand, and keep the economic engine running. But there was a problem, a massive one. Hong Kong still had to pay for all the things that kept the country running. Buses, trains, and even schools all needed government money to survive, and with less tax revenue coming in and the same money being spent, they were on the brink of a financial crisis. So, in a moment of desperation, the government turned once again to the colonial land system and started taking advantage of it by selling government-owned land to generate revenue. They didn't hold back and sold heaps and heaps of land, bringing in around $20 billion every single year. For the government, this was the perfect fix. Land sales alone covered more than 10% of the government's entire budget, enough to fully fund the city's entire public healthcare system. The formula was simple. Keep selling land, keep the money flowing, and keep the system running. But this gold rush wasn't for everyone. The average Hong Kong worker could barely afford rent, let alone buy land. So who was really snatching up all these million-dollar plots? When leadership changes, opportunities present themselves. The collapse of the Soviet Union gave rise to the oligarchs, and Hong Kong was no different. A small, ultra-wealthy elite saw the opportunity of a lifetime and seized it. As the government sold off their land at an unprecedented rate, a handful of powerful families quietly tightened their grip on Hong Kong's real estate market. Over time, 4 names stood above the rest: the Kwok, the Lee, and the Cheng families. But their influence extends far beyond real estate. With near infinite wealth, they formed strong business ties with both the Hong Kong government and mainland Chinese authorities. In theory, Hong Kong runs on a free market capitalist system, but in practice, housing is no market at all. It's a monopoly controlled by a few people. Their dominance wasn't just about property, it was about influence, control, and the ability to bend an entire city to their will. But just how powerful really are these tycoons? To understand the full scope of their dominance, let's take a closer look at their empire. The 4 families control these 4 property companies. They're more than just names. To the people of Hong Kong, they are the forces that shape the very skyline of the city and dictate the cost of calling their place home. Together, these 4 families have amassed a combined net worth exceeding $100 billion, more than the entire GDP of some nations. But their wealth isn't just measured in dollars. They own leverage over the market, the media, and the government. With that kind of power, the question is not if they will abuse it for profit, it's how they are going to do it. For years, these developers have mastered the art of market manipulation, strategically limiting the release of new apartments to keep supply tight, driving up the prices higher and higher. This artificial scarcity translates into staggering profit margins, among the highest in the world. While property developers in countries like the US and the UK live off margins around 15%, these firms routinely enjoy margins of 30 to 50%, raking in billions annually. Their ability to control supply not only artificially inflates the values, but also ensures that housing remains an increasingly unattainable luxury for many. To push their profits even further, they have been shrinking the size of apartments to extreme levels. With no real competition, nano flats, some as small as 120 square feet, barely enough room for a sink and a bed, are becoming an increasingly common trend amongst newly developed estates. For many lower middle class Hong Kong residents, these boxes were now their only options, with an estimate of over 220,000 people now living in these flats. Though instant government action seems incredibly necessary, the sheer political influence of these firms completely stops any significant changes from being made. Land policies remain in their favour, while public housing and affordability measures are deprioritised. The numbers tell a shocking story. Last year, the wealthiest 10% of Hong Kong households earned 82 times more than the poorest 10%. 5 years ago, that number was merely half as large. For over a decade, Hong Kong has consistently ranked among the top 10 most unequal places on Earth according to the Gini Index, and it has now surpassed every other country in Asia, a region already known for wealth divides. In a city of 8 million people, just 80 control 11% of Hong Kong's entire wealth. That's a higher concentration of wealth than Russia or South Africa, some of the most unequal nations in modern history. The rich grow richer simply by holding assets, while the working class fights just to keep a roof above their heads. And as property values soar, the gap between those who own land and those who rent it becomes insufferable. Economists have coined a new term for Hong Kong's paradoxical system: Pluto communism. Despite growing public outcry, the government has remained silent, its actions minimal and its solutions ineffective. In 2024, Chief Executive John Lee announced so-called reforms for subdivided housing. It made headlines, but coffin homes were explicitly excluded, leaving the city's worst living conditions still completely legal and thriving. Rent control was also dismissed, with officials claiming it would interfere with the market. There were no relocation plans, no safety nets, just a silent understanding. If you couldn't keep up, you were pushed into a cage. But this crisis isn't inevitable. In fact, other cities have faced similar challenges and found solutions. Take Singapore, a city with a population density the same as Hong Kong, yet virtually free from its housing nightmare. Why? Because decades ago, Singapore's government decided to take matters into their own hands. It established the Housing and Development Board, which today builds and manages over 80% of all homes, offering affordable, high-quality housing for all income levels. With abundant public housing, private developers had no room to exploit renters. On the other hand, South Korea allows the free market to still operate, but puts checks on greed. Instead of allowing billionaires to hoard properties, South Korea introduced a massive property gains tax reaching up to 50% of profits on multi-property owners. In Hong Kong, experts have done the same, calling for reform to broaden the tax base, increase the land supply, and enforce transparency. But every suggestion was ignored, because meaningful change would mean confronting the billionaires who profit from the crisis. Instead, the burden fell on the people, crushed by rising rents, shrinking spaces, and a government that chose wealth over welfare. The crisis is now severe. In 2023, there were more than 1,000 suicide deaths across Hong Kong, with 3 people a day taking their own lives because they simply couldn't bear the suffering. For much of its history, Hong Kong has been seen as a place where hard work led to success. Immigrants, entrepreneurs, and workers believed that if they put in the effort, they could carve out a better life for themselves. But that promise is now dead. The housing crisis has effectively ended social mobility. A university graduate entering the workforce today would need to save every penny of their salary for about 20 years just to afford a tiny apartment. Even professionals with stable jobs are stuck, living with parents into their 30s or crammed into shared micro-apartments. Over 80% of Hong Kong's youth believe that they'll never own a home, and many are choosing to leave altogether. From 2020 to 2022, 140,000 people, mostly young, educated professionals, left the city in search of a future elsewhere. Hong Kong's crisis is not a unique case. It's a cautionary tale for global cities facing similar inequality, from Singapore to London to New York. Real estate monopolisation and extreme inequality are growing problems worldwide, and if left unchecked, housing becomes less about providing shelter and more about investment opportunities for the wealthy. While every city has its own circumstances, the core issues remain the same. When housing becomes unattainable, so does economic stability for those who rely on it most. This isn't just a housing crisis, it's the result of a system built to protect wealth and power, no matter the cost. What began as a colonial land grab has evolved into a modern-day monopoly, refined under new rulers, but rooted in the same logic: extract as much as possible from the many to benefit the few. In Hong Kong, inequality wasn't an accident, it was engineered. Today, billionaires own empires of land, while the working class is packed into metal boxes. This is a warning, because if we allow housing to remain a tool for speculation, if we continue to accept extreme inequality as normal, then Hong Kong's present may soon become everyone's future. The clock is now ticking, but the question is, what will we do about it?